today, tweet me about it. So this is my Twitter handle. So if you're on the Twitterverse, go ahead and send me a tweet. Anyways, here is the foundation of it all. There's sort of three pillars that I build all of my research off of. One is theory. So this is a mathematical description of how you would expect data to behave. Simulation, this is where you take that theory and put it into a computer and start running experiments and seeing what it looks like and seeing what the universe of possibilities are for that theory. And that helps you design experiments. So the final step is then to go and run a real life experiment. But that experiment was built on theory and simulation before you got there. So here's a motivating example. We have Mario and a Koopa shell bobbing up and down and side to side. And I think most of you would think that you could measure these heights pretty accurately. But then I'm going to stop the background, and you're going to notice that this entire time, those two guys were moving in a circle. And the background was just moving in an opposing circle. And it was an optical illusion, and it made you think that they were moving back and forth. Okay, so let's turn this back on again, and you can see this in action with Mario moving in a circle, the Koopa moving in a circle, but the background moving in an opposing circle, so it looks to you like it's moving up and down. So now I want you to, in your head, translate this to your data, where you maybe have more than one moving thing, one moving part, and maybe there's some of that where you're thinking something's moving in a straight line when it's really moving in a circle, theoretically. So let's go back down to the very roots of what it means to have a spatial relationship. To have a spatial relationship means that you're close enough to have a cause and effect relationship. So if I come and I push you and you fall over, we had to be spatially close enough for that cause and effect relationship to happen. So what is close enough? Well, it depends on how fast you can get someplace and how far away you are. And so this now turns into the space-time problem of how big of a distance and how long of a time can you have a cause and effect relationship. So we're going to go over the pieces of what those mechanisms might look like. First, space. How did space even become a mechanism in this whole problem? Two, how does relative motion complicate that picture of space in our classic like 2D definition of space? And then finally, just at the very end, I'm going to give you a taste of my favorite shape, which is sort of the way that relative motion fits itself and captures space. All right. So let's talk about the roots of space as a mechanism. Well, it starts with these darn pest birds. Okay, so put yourself in 1000 BC. You're trying to grow a potato, and every spring, right when those potatoes are about to bloom, all these birds just come out of nowhere. You haven't seen them all winter, and they show up out of nowhere and eat all of your vegetation. And this was a real problem, and a lot of folklore came about around this temporal trend, right? But the people experiencing this were experiencing this bird influx as a temporal trend, and their entire world was, what is going on in time that is making this happen? The botanists, of course, thought that birds were blooming out of plants. So at the top, you see a little duck bottom coming out of a plant there. And so they every spring searched around for the magical plant that bred birds. The limnologists, of course, thought that the birds were hiding in lakes. Since only the top of the lake froze and the bottom stayed liquid, all the birds must be going and hiding in that water. So they would start cutting holes in ice and dredging the bottom of these lakes looking for the birds. And then there was this whole round of technologists and space entrepreneurs who thought that birds would move to the moon. And that was a really good place because it stayed warm. And so they started hooking contraption to them at the end of the season, hoping that these birds would take them back to the moon. And then finally, we got that one key piece of evidence. So this was 200 years ago today, 1822, not today, this year. Over Germany, a hunter shot down this bird and it already had this arrow in its neck. Now, what's cool is that this arrow had been in there for a couple months. It fully had scar tissue around it, and they were able to trace it down because it was an exotic collectible wood that was only produced in the middle of Africa. So it's native, it's endemic to the middle of Africa. They were able to actually like physically walk down there and track this back to the original tribe who had made it from this original batch of trees. And this was a complete aha moment. From this, banding was invented to start watching birds and where they were going. People started inventing early iterations of satellites and trying to do this remote sensing thing. And all of this idea that space was a mechanism that you would measure that would actually change the answer to the scientific questions you were asking, all of this came because of this bird and actual evidence where you could track it to a different location in space. And now over here on the right, you have a couple of years ago, this is now 10 years ago, the Lab of Ornithology produced this animation of 118 species moving between North and South America. And you just see the connection that they draw, right? And so when we're thinking now about cause and effect relationships, we have a much, much broader spatial scale to think about those at. We no longer are thinking about the length of our arm or the length of how far we can see on a landscape. Now we're thinking, oh, there really can be ecological connections at global scales due to movement. So this genius geographer bird sort of helped us start to stitch this question together. But this question is very old. And I'm going to sort of go through part of the debate of this whole thing just with a portion of this called velocity. So distance and time, those two combined are velocity. They're just part of the story, but it's a nice thread that we can follow. And the important thing about this thread is that there was a debate about how it scales. So if you think about how much distance you can cover in a specific amount of time, therefore, if you're trying to calculate the cause and effect relationship of migration, for example, and you want to know how much time does it take for a cause and effect relationship to happen between North and South America due to the migratory bird behavior, velocity matters there. And you might think, okay, this infinitely fast moving bird might be able to go and connect these things faster than a slow moving bird. And so velocity becomes part of this question of how quickly can you have cause and effect relationships across space. But the debate was, is there a speed limit here? Does this go straight? If I'm trying to calculate these things at really high speeds and at really large scales, like at the migratory bird scale, is there a speed limit? Can this go on forever? Can you go infinitely fast and far? And therefore we would have this evolutionary pressure for things to be super fast to be able to connect these things. Or is there a speed limit? Well, Galileo said there was a speed limit. He was wrong. Lorentz, he came up with this mathematical formulation saying, man, there really is a speed limit. There has to be a speed limit, but I don't know what that speed limit is. And to the hero of our story, Einstein, he says, I can tell you what the speed limit is. It's the speed that light happens to travel at. Light can travel as fast as you can travel, so it gets to go the speed limit. It doesn't set the speed limit, but it's the only thing that can go that fast. Everything else has to go slower and accordingly is heavier. But the important thing here is velocity has a speed limit, so it actually bends, it arcs through time. So when you're trying to project things into really large scales and you're trying to compare things across really large scales, you're not going to expect a straight line. You're going to expect a sublinear line with a little hook at the end, like a speed limit. So let me just give you a way to think about this in another story question. Okay, we're going to think about migration, about that bird moving back and forth, but we're going to think about it from a different frame. We're going to think about it from light, because light's the only thing moving at the speed limit. It's the fastest thing. It's sort of the main drive. It's the way to compare between reference frames. So reference frame is important. We're going to think of light as the primary reference frame and measure everything off of that. And then we're just going to acknowledge upfront that birds don't occupy the same reference frame that we do. They eat on the same ecology, but we're stuck to the planet and they are not. So those reference frames are going to be different and they might measure things differently. Okay, so here we're sitting on the sun, we're looking at the planet, and the planet's spinning in front of us. And so on the left, you have sunrise, on the right, you have sunset, and then the north and south poles. And what we might see a bird living in a niche of energy, we might see them occupy what we would measure as latitude and behavior time. So we would say, we see this bird active from 2 hours before sunrise until 2 hours after sunrise in North America, for example. Okay? And so you would have different birds occupying different parts of this energy niche and showing different data qualities on this latitude versus daily behavior time. So let me just show you a little animation. So here we're sitting on the sun and that little dot is where the center is hitting. So this would be a bird occupying that center niche. And what you're seeing is the migratory pattern that would be imposed on that bird from our perspective just by the movement of the planet. So the bird staying in that one place is making that figure 8 on the planet called the analemma. So the analemma is a pretty common tool in geography to map the movement of sun. Here, if you just use it as the translation between reference frames, you can sort of see the null migration pattern that a bird would map out if they were staying in one place relative to the sun. So here I've just spun that 90 degrees. So you're looking at it from the side. So the center of the sun is from on the right side, and you're seeing a dome of energy. And then I've cracked open that dome of energy so that you can see the planet moving in underneath it in the figure 8. So these are the parts of our model. We have the energy in 3-dimensional dome. We have the spinning component on the inside that you have to translate between. And then on the back is nighttime. And so if you clip those two together, the line between night and day is called the solar terminator. You experience that as sunrise and sunset each day. So we can actually use this as a data model where we say, okay, if the bird is living in that, sorry, let me go back. On that left side, I have niche space, mean location, and home range. So the niche space is a ring of constant energy. So in the energy dome, it's just more intense to less intense. So that ring where I have highlighted is all the same energy. It's all the same. But what is different is where that ring correlates with some underlying resource on the surface. And so that's going to constrain them to a home range where the ring and the surface conditions match up. And so if you imagine all of those moving around and the bird just tracking where the two of those combined match up, you're going to see potentially that figure 8. So we have the data comparison, and I just wanted to point out here that the variance scales in a weird way because of the weird motion. So towards the cross, you get the variance is almost 0, but then the variance inflates around the edge. So if you look at real data, which you can, you're going to see more variance at the top and bottom. This is me just giving you a little more detail on the same phenomenon. So that blue ring on the left is our niche ring. And I want you to imagine spinning a baseball or a basketball on your finger. The center, big part of that basketball is actually going faster to keep up with the rest of the ball than right next to your finger is going slower. So if you're a bird trying to just ignore this fast moving planet underneath you, zone A at the bottom is the lowest energy. That's the easiest place. So you expect an individual to spend most of their time in A. But as the planet moves throughout the year and you're lining up with your surface resources ceases for some moment, you might have to venture up either B or C to the other secondary zone on the top, D. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is that if you're in A and you go up B and then you come back down B, you're going to make an S from our perspective. If you go up B and down C, you're going to make a figure 8, like the one on the right. So we see a slightly different dynamic based on how they're moving around in these rings. Here's some data that I did not collect. This is from a different paper from 2006 where they had took these birds, held them over for a season, surgically implanted some trackers in them, held them over until the next season, and then let them go. And some of them were successful, some of them weren't, but they were sort of early tries at doing this. But one of the very first things they noted was this figure 8 pattern. They attributed it to wind, but they didn't. They pointed out that there's a really noticeable figure 8 pattern here. So I took those 22 birds, their data from that study, and I just looked at how they would look if translated. And you see most of this sheet all the way down to 15 or 16. So the first 4 rows, all of those individuals stayed in that bottom A primary zone. They were never caught in a position where they couldn't keep their thermal niche needs and their surface needs aligned at the same time. But as you get down to the second to last row, you see individuals get pushed up into that transition zone where it's pretty unstable and start to make parts of an S shape, but then come back down or go extinct. And then on the very bottom, you get individuals who went from the primary zone up to the secondary zone. And then the very last 2 were the only 2 that came back down. So we were able to see them. The tracker survived all the way until they came back home to New Zealand. So only 2 out of 22 trackered individuals actually made the entire journey. But out of those, we see the signature of the expectation for the data. If you just take all of the data and just plot them in the converted ring, so this is sort of the range limit of those individuals in the energy ring without the translation back to the way that you would see them. And you see that they pretty much sort of randomly occupy as much of the ring as they possibly can. But that for these birds, that top area is largely off limits, largely because it's covered with land most of the time. Okay, so let's move on to some a human question. Right? Zoom down to what's been happening on the surface. And instead of thinking about a lot of spatial movement at the same time, we think about small differences in spatial movements over long periods of time. So this is fundamentally combining sort of spatial ecological data with phylogenetic historical data as a spread rate. Okay. And specifically, the trait we're going to use to talk about this is agriculture. Agriculture is arguably the most transformative trait that humans have ever acquired. Somewhere between 100 and 300,000 years, we existed as tribes people foraging for natural resources. Then after that huge expanse of time, all within 1,000 years, 27 independent locations all sprouted up agriculture, and it spread and took over the planet within 4,000 years. So this is like a fundamentally strange thing to happen where we have stasis for hundreds of thousands of years, and then all of a sudden we have this innovation and our whole everything, the whole world of humans changes. So there's been a fundamental question of first, I'm going to go through a couple of questions related to this. First is, why did that happen? Why did that sort of anomalous innovation happen when it happened? So like, why was it that date? Why did it not happen 10,000 years earlier or 50,000 years earlier? And there are a lot of existing heavily debated hypotheses around this. One is the surplus hypothesis, which is that it was a time of bounty. There was just naturally great conditions. Things flourished. Humans did not have to worry about collecting food, and they all of a sudden could start tinkering with nature. The necessity hypothesis is that things were going really poorly. Humans were crashing, and we had to innovate our way out of extinction. So we went and got after it and made some innovations happen. And then the third one is the regional uniqueness hypothesis, which is just that all of those 27 independent origins all have different stories behind them. There's no unifying story that can be told to join those. So we used global climate hindcasting to try to answer this question. So there are only 130 domesticated species. We built species distribution models for each one of those, linked those with climate conditions, and then modeled those climate conditions back for 20,000 years, and just looked at how likely the conditions were to increase human populations because of their agricultural domesticates over that time period. And that's the graph you're seeing right now, is how good were conditions, how good did conditions translate into making more people. And you can see that over all of the major sources of origin sources of domestication, there was this 1,000-year window of positive upslope in the blue line. So conditions were good in all of these origin locations. The red lines you're seeing are the heavy red line is when we see a genetic signature of domestication in the domesticate. The dotted line is when you see preferential use of the domesticate. So in the locations, we don't always have dug up archaeological data for the sort of when they started to favor it, but some of those we do. But pretty much all of them, because domesticates are all so genetically sequenced now, for most of them, we know that origin of domestication change. And you just see that across the globe for this window that human cultures were actively working on their domesticates, you see positive conditions across all of the locations, supporting the surplus hypothesis. All right, when we think about relative motion, I want to talk about all of the things that are moving. So first we have the spread of people. People as animals, they're breeding as pairs and making new offspring. And we're making more people in some places and fewer people in other places. But you could look at a DNA tree, a DNA phylogeny of humans, and get one signature of spread across the globe. Separately, and this is what we had as our primary data source, was a spread of culture. So this is, you can take languages and look at how languages spread and split and spread across the planet. And that gives you an idea of sort of how thoughts were moving and structures of government and stuff were moving. On top of that, we have spread of agriculture, which is a technology and an idea that had its own ability to move independent of what your culture was or how many people you had. And then finally, we are constrained by environment. So both the people and the domesticates had ecological constraints that made them so they couldn't go anywhere. You had to go only some places. So if we set out to actually model all of those, I'm going to just give you a quick break of me talking. This is just languages, Anatolian languages spreading across Europe. Okay. So what you saw was the spatial version of what a phylogeny would represent now in front of you. This is sort of vertical transmission. You get a single language, and then you get a couple diasporas splitting off of that, and then a couple diasporas splitting off of that, and then you get a couple diasporas splitting off the original one. But it's all about this new species splitting off for old ones. So there is a lot of evidence and a lot of research going into the fact that cultural evolution is very vertically distributed, like the one on the left. So cultures act much like genetics, where you can't move them between. But when we go one level above to that agricultural trait, now we move into this tree over on the right, which has horizontal transmission. So this is a tree that you might see in like a bacterial tree, because bacteria can just throw their genes to another bacteria and suck up genes from the environment. But as you get like to the big critters with sexual reproduction, this is much less common. But now you scale up to the next scale, and things with sexual reproduction now at the cultural level are expressing this horizontal transmission again. So as we stack phylogenies at different scales, some of them are what we call reticulated, where they have crosses, and some are vertical, where they're not reticulated. So there had been this outstanding question for a really long time about, was agriculture reticulated or not? And there were two really deeply entrenched schools of thought. So the left one is the idea that an idea can move independently between cultures. So one culture could steal or borrow or be taught something from a neighboring culture, and they can maintain their own cultural identity while doing that, meaning like their own genetics even. The one on the right, the Jared Diamond takeover hypothesis, he purported that agriculture was more like a super trait. And so if you got agriculture, then you were able to defeat your neighbors. And so you did. And so what this means is that I would have offspring, and those offspring would go take over my neighbor and replace them. So my neighbor would go extinct, and my genes would then be taking over both locations. So in the Jared Diamond hypothesis world, you have a much higher level of extinction as you have to displace a bunch of societies to take them over as agriculturalists. On the left one, you don't ever have to physically replace anyone. The idea can just spread independently amongst everyone. On the right, what you're seeing are our data. So this is the human language tree. Inside the gray is old. So the center point is the very first language. And then the gray line is when agriculture was invented. And so you see that several different independent branches all have agriculture. And you say, okay, well, obviously they didn't all come from a single agricultural origin. What happened here? Okay, and so we try to get at the cause and effect relationship here, but we really had to wind up modeling the background expectations of the universe. It's like, what does a tree look like under Aldemic? What does a tree look like And so that's the first one. Endemic is vertical transmission. That first one you saw, this would be the idea could only be passed to your offspring. And those offspring have to go take over somebody else in order for agriculture to spread. The second one is that you can add to that, like, because there's sort of an assumption that you're going to teach your offspring the better of the two and the one that you do anyways. So an agriculturalist, their offspring are likely to become agriculturalists. But this cultural model lets them then share it with neighbors without taking them over. The takeover model lets them share it, but they have to take over and make somebody go extinct in order to do that. And then the ensemble model at the bottom has the horizontal transmission plus the extinction dynamic. And here we had the large reason we had to simulate it so we could see the entire mechanism in the phylogeny is because of Galton's problem, which is the same as Tobler's problem, which is that if you see something clumped in space or in phylogeny, that doesn't necessarily tell you anything about cause and effect, right? Here you can see that we can get the same clumping pattern through vertical or horizontal transmission. We needed something more there. We needed a historical signature to follow. So we simulated the spread of these things under these different conditions, and then at the end use statistics drawn from those trees to compare them and try to see which one was more likely. Specifically, here we made a phylogenetic spread of each model type. Each of them operated on the same environmental gradient that I told you about with the 130 domesticated species. This sort of says where humans can move and where they can't move and where they're more and less effective. And so we simulated all of human history. This was about 18 months and 1,700 cores on this supercomputer, just cranking. And eventually we had just these universes of possibilities. We had, this is what happens under endemic. This is what happens with the little cultural transmission. This is what happens with the other models. And then we can take our one known phylogeny and use machine learning to throw it at those universes and say which universe does this most likely populate. And with fairly good confidence, we can say that it's the cultural transmission one. So this is the idea that it's shared. And this is reinforced by the idea that 4,000 years is too fast for us to repopulate the entire planet just through reproduction. This sort of agriculture had to spread faster than we can reproduce. It had to be shared. It had to be able to move independently. Okay. Let's come back down to Earth a little bit on thinking about future climate change. Okay. We have two little stories that are going to take us home over the last 10, 15 minutes. Okay. So this is where I grew up. This is the Grand Mesa in Western Colorado. And this is sort of a famous overlook that you can stop at and look down at the ski resort, which is down in that little bowl. But the thing I want to point out is that the line between those aspen and those evergreens is climatically determined. And so over the course of my lifetime, I've seen this line march up the hill slowly. And so for me, this experience was only validated when I sort of started reading the literature and found that there are lots and lots of people observing this same thing. Camilo Parmesan is one of the most famous to just highlight that all up and down and across the phylogenetic tree, species are either moving towards the poles or up mountains to track their climate. So the climate that they used to have, the little window that they were well adapted to for a long time, that thing is moving. And we need to answer some fundamental questions like, can they chase it? Will they chase it? Which species will chase it and which one won't? And is there anything that we can do to help? So this is from the IPC executive summary. And what you're seeing on the y-axis is how fast species can move. This is like a geographic trajectory of a pocket of good climate that's moving northward. And for some species like a butterfly, they move long distances for part of the year, and then they need to like cocoon down for part of the year. So they have high variance. So there's a lot of questions about whether they'll be able to track it or not. But things like trees, it's sort of pretty obvious that they're not going to come close to tracking their climate under most of the projected climate projections. So let's talk about this a little bit on how this model builds up, and then what we might be able to do about it. Okay, so in the standard species distribution model, we have different polygons representing different affinities of the climate that the species needs. So here in the blue, it's temperatures that they like. In the green, it's wind speeds that they like. In orange, it's solar exposure that they like. So if you find places where everything is right, you find more of those species. So if we look at the spatial distribution of a population, that spatial distribution has an anatomy. There's a core where new individuals are actually being produced. We have positive growth rate, climate conditions are matched, habitat conditions are matched. And then you have this periphery where things are not reproducing, but they still exist. And a lot of this is overflow from the core going out there. And then eventually you get some presence absence boundary where you don't find them at all. So if I were going to do a transect through there, I would produce data like you see at the top. So I'm going to use that as a shorthand. I'm going to use the 1D version instead of the 2D version, just so we can have a simpler conversation. Okay. So, so here we're going to have a core where things are really good, and then a periphery where the habitat itself conditions are not good. Like there's a negative growth rate, but individuals still exist there because they're flowing out of the core. There are some really good models to model this, and those models fundamentally have two parts. There is a growth part, so we use distributions, and we draw from distributions to see how much something grows, and then we draw from distributions to see how much they disperse. And with the combination of those two things, you can replicate experimental results really well. But I'm going to give you a little idea of how this behaves. Okay, so right now we have two patches of good habitat. Those are building up a population in the center that's overflowing, and we're seeing the whole population as it's available. As I just increased habitat there, I didn't change the shape at all. All I did was make it bigger. So if I increase the habitat again, all that's going to do is make this stack bigger. But if I start moving it, right? The question is, how does the population move? What mechanism does it use to actually start tracking this? Okay, one that might pop into our head is unlimited habitat. So let's just make unlimited habitat available right now. And you're going to see a different dynamic. You see what's called a dispersal wave. So you see this wave of a species moving across good habitat. This is what you would see with an invasive species, for example. But everything behind the wave, this is all at carrying capacity, bouncing around randomly around carrying capacity, and this wave down to nothingness. That's not what we're talking about, okay? What I'm talking about is this constrained, thinking about the full range limit of a species. So the full complement of the full scope of its spatial extent. I can move forward. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to add the habitat speed component to it. There we go. Okay, so let's start from that same starting point. We have two patches of good habitat and this population just happily sitting there. And then we start moving the habitat. So now the habitat is tracking northward, and immediately we see some changes. The whole mode of the population drops down. So we see fewer individuals in the good habitat. We compress on the front, so we're not blasting out quite as far on one side, and we're trailing out farther on the other side. So this whole asymmetry develops in the system, and the overall abundance goes down. But if we let this simulation keep going for about 80 simulations, or 80 loops, what we see is that the population eventually starts to collapse just through stochasticity. So we have introduced, just by moving this habitat, but leaving everything else the same, we've introduced enough randomness to make it go from stable long-term to unstable long-term. So we set up an experiment using flower beetles. These are little 2 millimeter long beetles that live in baking flour, and you can calibrate how good the habitat is based on how much wheat flour or corn flour you put them in. Okay, so we can set sort of like the exact growth rate that we want. And so we set 3 treatments. There's a high and low habitat speed, a high and low habitat size, and a high and low dispersal rate. The way we do habitat patches, right? So these are little plastic acrylic boxes. That's what we put the medium in. We let them grow for 5 weeks, which is their whole gestation period. We then remove the adults, put the eggs into fresh flour. Those eggs get 24 hours to develop, and then they get sieved out and put into fresh flour. So we can monitor growth rate in the experiment every 5 weeks at the end of their generation time and see how many new have been produced, and then put the offspring back in. Spatial spread, we use little holes between them with little transparencies to block dispersal, and then we can pull out those transparencies for either 6 or 24 hours to have different dispersal rates. And we ran this for a little over 3 years. right? This took 24 undergrads. They counted 250,000 beetles a week for years on end. And what we found, so you see the treatments here on the left half are slow habitat movement, on the right are fast habitat movement. And so the first thing we see is more asymmetry when we add motion. So just adding motion added asymmetry to the population and lowered the total abundance that the population was able to achieve. But then I also wanted to focus on this this poor guy on the right, where it was low dispersal, small habitat, and fast movement, and 9 out of the 11 went extinct. So if we say, okay, how are we going to save that? Well, we have really 3 options. One, we could slow down climate change, which is slowing down that habitat movement. I'm all for it. Might be at a slightly larger scale than this one species. The other is creating more habitat. So the larger batch sizes also added some resilience to the system. This has been the sort of conservation strategy for 50 or 60 years, and it's working marginally well, but there's not much more gas we can put into that particular engine. So the last one is to sort of help individuals move, to actually go physically move them. And a lot of people are doing this, particularly the tree people, as I showed you. They're having the hardest time. And a lot of tree plantations are privately owned, not publicly owned. And so the owners can go and start just moving their trees. And so they are sort of doing this en masse. So we set up an experiment in our same beetle system after the last one, where we set them on that same trajectory to extinction. So we knew roughly how they would go extinct. And then we said, okay, we're going to collect 100 individuals from the back and move them to the front. Of course, first we simulated it to see sort of how we could set up the experiment. And this specifically was how many patches ahead of the good habitat should we place the transplanted beetles? Where should you put them where it's actually effective? And if you see at the very top, this is 5 patches ahead, and it was not effective. The black line is where they started. Then we started transplanting, and you see the population quickly just collapses out. 4 patches ahead, same. 3 patches ahead, the same. 2 patches ahead, the same. And then finally, at 1 patch ahead, you wind up getting enough of a delay so the individuals drop into the bad habitat. They have 1 generation, and by the time they are at prime reproductive rate, the good habitat has moved over them, and they both amplify, and you get really good population numbers. But then if you actually drop the transplanted individuals into the suitable habitat, it's too late, and they all die out. So you can see out of our simulations, we showed that there was really only one way to do it that was successful, and every other way would fail fairly quickly. So we ran the experiment. You're seeing time going down with the controls on the left and the treatments on the right. So in the control, where there was no assisted migration, we just like set them on that trajectory to extinction. Everybody was gone after 9 generations, but most were gone after 6 generations. So it did effectively, just adding that movement did effectively drive these things to extinction in 6 generations. On the right, you see where we applied assisted migration. And by the end, we had about 1/3 left that were still chugging along at actually totally reasonable numbers and showing genetic modifications towards longer dispersal and faster reproductive times. So it both saved them demographically, and it seemed to be saving them sort of genetically, evolutionarily. It was actually having an evolutionary genetic rescue effect. Okay, another little, so we're now to the final vignette of translating speed limits to space. So what you're seeing is a fractal tree pattern. And this is what happens when you organize speeds in space. You see these in rivers, you see these in trees, you see these in transport road networks in cities. And this is all because it makes sense to have fast moving stuff together and slow moving stuff together, okay? So this is the standard shape that you see. And in the center here, you would have fast things that need to be big in order to move fast, and therefore have to travel a certain minimum distance to reach their speed. So we think about a highway where you have big things moving fast for long distances. All the way at the end, at the terminal end, this might be your desk where you sit down and you don't move for a very long time. And so we actually spatially segregate and spatially align all of the different inertial reference frames. This happens in bodies, which gives us this. So see this hook that we're seeing? This is that velocity speed limit that we opened with. So the blood is constrained in a tree network. And so as tree networks get bigger and bigger and bigger, the velocity scales exactly like you would expect it of body mass and speed. There is a famous experiment that was done in cities where they laid down a 60-meter climbing rope and just timed how long it took people to walk from one end to the other end of the climbing rope. And based on how big the city is, you can almost perfectly predict how fast people are going to walk that 60-meter rope, and it's different for every city. And that, again, is because speed limits. The network of the city sets the speed limit, and everything scales down from that. And so in these network systems, speed limits become totally crucial. Here's just a little thought experiment. We have a bunch of green space and we can connect it in 3 different ways. We can make every single pairwise connection, number 1. Number 2, we can make really select pairwise connections. Or number 3, we can make a fractal connection. With everything, like plowing over all of the in-between space and making it all green for connections, we get an average occupancy of these patches of 0.2. If I do a selected number, that drops proportionally as I would expect. So if I have half as many, I get like half as much occupancy. But with a little fractal magic of connecting these things with fractals instead of big connections, I actually get an overall increase of abundance over connecting everything by having this fractal arrangement. This, again, is because of speed limits and arranging things so everything can move the way that it wants to move without running into other stuff. So what should we remember about this talk? Velocities don't scale linearly. They bend towards a speed limit. So as things get bigger, they get more efficient. So as cities get bigger, they move things around more efficiently. As body sizes get bigger, they move things around efficiently. As forests get bigger, they move things around more efficiently. A critter that's twice as big does not use twice as much energy. Relative motion, changing reference frame can change your measurement, but not the mechanisms. So if you can align all your reference frames to identify the mechanisms don't change between reference frames, only your measurements do. And finally, my favorite shape, which is these dendritic fractals, are just this beautiful example of this rule of having to segregate velocities and try to fit them into a single space. Finally, go on a climate change diet, which is eat less meat and ride your bike more. And now it's time for loving applause and complimentary questions. Let me stop sharing.
Getting lots of applause. Thank you, Ty.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see that. It looks wonderful.
Looks like Matt will start us off.
So great talk. Really enjoyed it. I want to go back to your first example that you provided. Although I love fractals as well, so maybe I have to pick and choose. But the question I asked is, like, in fluid mechanics, right? We come up with all these non-dimensional numbers, which are basically telling us the characteristic scales of different velocities. And have you thought about like how your same kind of application of these scales, right? So the birds are kind of a weird organism in that, they are both land-based and air-based. So there's these different velocities you're thinking about, but you could think about extending it to like evolutionary scales, geologic scales, where you have continents moving, and how you could use some sort of, I don't know, a non-dimensional number to tell you what the most useful frame of reference will be.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good idea. From my experience with the non-dimensional numbers, they sort of tell you how close you are in scale versus how far you are in scale. So for the birds, they've showed like a really high dimensional number just because it's like a massive scale and a tiny scale interacting. And then like me in my bedroom is like me scale, bedroom scale together. And so in the water, you get like these vortexes where they all like unify and they're the same. But yeah, I think you're right. It's just in my experience, it's mainly just told me about the variance in the system. It sort of told me like the variance in the scale.
So, but like the example I was thinking of was perhaps like, thinking about penguin migration, right, as being not reflective of the scales of atmospheric processes, but instead maybe ocean currents, which are happening over longer scales. Yeah. Could there be a similar kind of analysis you could apply to that?
Yeah, 100%. In my world, what I've historically done is what I call the shuttle model, where it was like you're shuttling between reference frames. So the bird lands in their nest, and now they're on the same reference frame as me, going around the planet. And then they hit that terminator and they switch into the other reference frame and fly, and the planet moves around a little bit, and then they land again. And so they're specifically moving between those two reference frames. And so with the penguin, now you get a third reference frame of the ocean, surface, and air. But essentially, yeah, you just say the reference frame of under the ocean, the reference frame of the surface, and the reference frame of the air, and have them shuttle between that, assuming they can't be in multiple reference frames at the same time.
All right, Elsa.
Hey, great talk, Ty. That was really fascinating. I guess I had a really similar question to Matt, which is related to my experience biking around cities quite a bit. That I always sort of thought that there might be an eigenvalue for the speed that you can go on a bicycle that keeps your energy going the best with where the stoplights are set up. Which I guess is a little bit of a different concept from a speed limit, but I guess I wonder if you think there might be some kind of resonance to that speed limit as well in these networks.
Yeah, for sure. As far as I know, they actually plan those lights around that. And so, yeah, it's like how long you get and what your max speed of the bike is. And then they actually try to get lights to disrupt that. So you have to stop and not run at max speed all the time. Unless you get like one of the big commuter lane things, like the big regional bike paths. But yeah, 100%. These inflict spatial rules on you. And these are shown like in studies widely across the transport literature that it just imposes spatial rules on you that are very strange and hard to realize, but that you can go faster in one town than another town because of how the entire network is set up, which I think is pretty crazy. Yeah. Feel free to ask wacky questions. They don't have to be intelligent.
I'd like to ask a question about the assisted migration, since that's closer to my knowledge.
Yeah.
So I think that's fascinating that you can put a species so far ahead and it just fails. It's still like the whole assisted migration, this like incredibly expensive effort will just fail if it's not done at a particular time, particular interval. So I'm kind of wondering what you think is maybe you address this, but what the mechanism is kind of behind that, of why you can only put it one patch ahead. Is it like a phenology thing? Is it? Yeah.
It's sort of, it's because the window is so narrow, because we're showing something with just enough habitat to be surviving anyway. And then you make that start moving fast. So it was sort of a case that was specifically picked because it's right on the edge of catastrophe. Now, and then there's just this relentless treadmill nature to the thing. So it's not like it moved once and you can go just like hit it there and you're done. It's like the thing is moving constantly. And so, you have to hit it enough ahead to where it comes in and is good right at the right time. And you can just imagine a treadmill example and how hard that is. And, in our example, we controlled for everything. So we knew exactly what the growth rate was in the good habitat, and we knew exactly where the boundary was between the good and bad habitat. And we still only got a third of the cases to survive in the treatment. So the idea, like out in nature, even be able to define where those boundaries, those first three things that we were able to control, defining those things would take a decade. And then like to know how fast it's moving so you would know where it was at a specific place. All of that is just monumentally hard. And I think that was the conclusion we drew from this experiment, is like, it can work. If you have everything totally perfect, it can work a third of the time. But if you're going to go and spend like gazillions of dollars and lots of human effort, you got to be okay with some disappointment, because a lot of these things are just going to fail. And we tried lots of ways to make them work, but like the population dynamics just don't work out. And these things like just go extinct really easily. So I think that was the message, is like, it can work, but it probably won't. And you probably don't want to waste your money with it. Unless you are talking about one of those other populations where it was already huge and not like barely surviving, then you might be able to do some more good, but we didn't run that experiment. We ran the tiny, barely surviving one.
That totally answers my question. I think that's a fascinating result.
Yeah.
Because I feel like assisted migration is often like the silver bullet that some people kind of present as like, oh, well, we can just move them, if they're not doing well.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's just so many variables like going into play.
Yeah. If we could stop climate change so the windows would hit some end point, then that would probably, I would think that would be a totally possible, a much better possibility. But the fact now you just like expect them to go and just march off the end of the planet, it's much harder to imagine how it would work for a lot of things.
Do we have any more questions?
I'll go with one more, since I want to hear some more of your thoughts on kind of fractal systems, which is, I feel like, one of the things that you showed with the example is they're very efficient systems, right? With few nodes, you can move a lot of information or whatever you care about, right? Yeah. But I guess one of the things is, like I think a lot about river networks, and I think about rivers a lot, and they're fractal in nature. Of course, the exponents on those fractals are somewhat different than what you might think of kind of a perfectly efficient system. Is because there's this trade-off, I think, between transfer of energy and extraction of momentum, and extraction of energy from the flow. And so that's what you're looking, is the net balance of those things. I was wondering if there's any insights you have into like, how do you pick up on what those two speed limits, those two behaviors that are emerging from the fractal systems, by looking at, say, where you no longer have fractal behavior. So like the thresholds to where you start producing this kind of self-organized behavior.
Yeah. Let's see. I think I am answering your question, but if not, bring me back to it. But I think the answer is back to reticulation. So the perfect fractal, like the perfect river, is a vertically organized phylogeny, right? Like the current above it is the one driving the current below it, and those are connected vertically. And if you wanted to slow down the river, you could go and like dig trenches to connect the two rivers, and now all of a sudden their currents start affecting each other and slowing each other down. So when we were thinking about this problem largely in the context of building urban green space corridors and saying, okay, if we make a perfectly efficient fractal network, are we going to just make it too easy for a bunch of invasives to constantly come in all the time? How do we modulate this? And so what we started modeling it, and it showed that it does in fact just sort of slow the thing down linearly to add reticulation. So you just strategically add reticulation points to your perfect vertical network, and that makes things collide in on each other, and they lose their velocities, and you can sort of slow the whole system down through that reticulation. So I think that's the best answer I have, is like, if you want to slow things down, you start connecting them in non-efficient ways.
Mike, did you have a question?
Yeah, so just back to the assisted migration, I was wondering how much the answer that you got depends on this being an annual system versus something that's perennial that can sort of stick around for a little while longer, and there's some bed hedging inherent in that life history strategy that might allow them to accommodate some of that movement. Yeah,
I would imagine that would make a really big difference. Our system and our model is sexually reproducing, 5-week distinct, like non-overlapping lifespan. So we don't have any overlap in anything. So even if you had two counter oscillating populations, subpopulations of the same population, that would help a lot. So yeah, there are lots of ways that you could stretch this. One of those is, staggering reproduction over the time would really help. I think we were really thinking about megafauna, and like, people would be wanting to move megafauna that would have these type of restrictions.
Well, I think we will wrap up. Just as an FYI, next week we are hoping to do an in-person option. Adam has said that he's comfortable with that. So hopefully we'll be able to test out using the OWL and doing the hybrid system in the Viz studio. So if you guys are here, you're welcome to attend in person. If you're not, that's totally fine.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks, guys.